This video is part of Lesson 2 in the course Survey of the New Testament. In this video, the 4 Gospels.
The second video lesson of this survey of the New Testament is about the 4 Gospels. And it has 3 parts. First, about written Gospels. Why are Gospels written? Secondly, something about the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are called the Synoptic Gospels. And then briefly about the Gospel of John. As an introduction, we are blessed with 4 Gospels in the New Testament, written down as they are. The 4 Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's interesting to look at the writers and to see their own series of special points they make. That makes it a rich report from different points of view. It is like an incident which has taken place and different people have seen it, but they tell us their own report from their own point of view. So different witnesses can tell us a lot about the same incident to make up for a complete picture. First item in this lesson is about written Gospels, and the question is, why are the Gospels written? They are written because of the spread of the Gospel message. It was impossible for the people of the early church to spread the Gospel by mouth only. The second reason for writing the Gospels was that as time went by, the apostles became older. And there was a sense of urgency that the material should be recorded, written down, before those who knew it best were not alive anymore. And nobody knew when Christ would return. They hoped that he would come back soon, but nobody knew really when that exactly would be. But perhaps the main reason for recording the Gospels was the need for factual material with facts to use in the instruction of new converts. They needed to be instructed in the basic facts of Christ's life, and they needed to know that the Old Testament history and prophecies were fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ. So that is the answer to the question, why are the Gospels written? Now we turn to the Gospel of Matthew. What do we have to know about the first Gospel in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew? It is the first Gospel in our New Testament part of the Bible, and it is the longest one. The book is written by Matthew, the apostle of Jesus Christ, who was called Levi before and who was a tax collector in the service of the Romans. Matthew begins his gospel by writing down the genealogy of Jesus, starting with Abraham. So it is clear that Matthew writes his gospel for the Jews. In the first place, because Abraham is their father, and also he mentions David, who is their great king. He wants to show the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus came to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament. Let's look, for instance, at Matthew 1, verse 22 and 23. There we read, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. We see that Matthew wants to emphasize the prophecy telling us that Jesus is the true Messiah. Another example is Matthew 2, verse 15. It says, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" So Matthew uses the Old Testament again and again to show his readers and us that Jesus is the Messiah who is spoken about many times in the Old Testament. We turn to the Gospel of Mark. What is important to know about the Gospel of Mark? This is the shortest Gospel we have. Mark also tells us the story of Jesus of Nazareth, and he wants to describe the impact he had on those who came into contact with him. Mark wrote a short, compact manual for missionary work in the early church. He highlights the major episodes of the life of Jesus, and the gospel can be used and has been used to introduce to us who Jesus was. And it seems Mark had a special friendship with Peter, and maybe they worked together in the early church, because Mark often mentions Peter in his gospel, and he starts with the calling of Peter as the first of the disciples. And sometimes he mentions Peter instead of all the disciples. Let's read and compare Mark 11, verse 21. It's about the withered fig tree. "As they passed in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots, and Peter remembered and said to him, 'Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered.'" If we read the same text from the Gospel of Matthew, the same story, it only mentions when the disciples saw this, they were amazed. But Mark mentions Peter specifically. Let's look at the third Gospel, the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke has written 2 books in the New Testament. And what do we have to know about his Gospel? The Gospel of Luke is a companion volume with the book of Acts, which is also written by Luke. And the language and structure of the 2 books indicate that both are written by the same person, and they're also addressed to the same person. He was called Theophilus. It was a Greek man who wanted to know as much as possible about the Lord Jesus Christ. The first characteristic of Luke is the emphasis on the universal nature of God's dealings with the world. Matthew traces Jesus' ancestry back to David and Abraham, the great founders of the Jewish nation. But Luke goes back to the very beginning of the human race, Adam himself. And Luke places the birth of Jesus between historical facts. In chapter 2, he mentions the reign of Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor by that time. And there are several verifiable facts at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry in chapter 3. Jesus, that's what Luke wants us to know. Jesus is part of the concrete human history. Luke also has a special interest in the events of Jesus' early life and the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And possibly Luke had this information from Mary herself, because he was in the country of Canaan with Paul, the apostle. It is only Luke who tells us the Christmas story as the whole world knows it. And in his whole gospel, Luke has a lot of attention for the place of women. He mentions their names. In chapter 8, we read about Joanna and Susanna, women which were with Jesus and followed him. And in chapter 10, we read about Mary and Martha. And he also pays much attention to the criminal on the cross. In the Gospel of Luke, we read about the conversation of Jesus with this criminal. The other Gospels just mention the criminal without mentioning the conversation of Jesus. And this is what Luke wants us to know. Jesus came for all of them, Jews and Gentiles, men and women. They are all loved by God and all need salvation. What about the fourth Gospel? The Gospel of John, just briefly. The first three Gospels are known as the synoptic Gospels. And it means they share similar stories, chronologies, teachings, and emphasis. And the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, supplements them, giving a richer picture than if we rely on the three Gospels alone, the three synoptic Gospels. The fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, has its own stories and points of view. John has written much about the conversations of Jesus with people like the Samaritan woman. And he writes about miracles Jesus did. And these miracles are called by Jesus the signs of his kingdom. So that's just briefly about the Gospel of John. Concluding this video and summarizing, we have four Gospels. All writers tell us who Jesus is from their different points of view. And we read the Gospels, we discover a lot about Jesus and what he has done for us. And knowing more about the background of the writers of the Gospels helps us to understand more of the Gospel each of them has written for us.
You have been watching the video, The Four Gospels in the course, Survey of the New Testament. We hope to see you again next lesson.